All right, in 1 week, it is the Senate's turn to get to work on the House version of President Trump's so-called One Big Beautiful Budget and Tax Bill. Key changes that got House Republicans over the finish line last week. The original timeline of 2029 as the start of Medicaid work requirements was pushed up to 2026. The state and local tax deduction cap was hiked from $10,000 to $40,000 for people making up to $500,000 a year. The bill also speeds up the end date for green tax credits to 2028 and eliminates partial credits altogether. But if you thought there were fiscal hawks that held up the process in the House, wait till you see what's in the Senate. So the $3.8 trillion question is, how will it be paid for? Because that's what the Congressional Budget Office says the bill will cost over 10 years. Where is the growth engine, the revenue engine in this monster truck of a bill? Here to answer that and much more is the Council of Economic Advisors Chair, Stephen Miran. Great to have you, Stephen. The administration is selling this bill as a growth engine, but math is math. We talked about this CBO predicting that it would cost $3.8 trillion. But let me just ask you first, because you really are somebody who can talk senators into this. Which part of the bill do you believe will generate the most revenue in the first 12 months of it?
Look, thanks for having me. Look, the entire bill is going to generate revenue through generating economic growth. What the people who score these things do is they look at tiny bits of the picture without looking at the entire picture. And one of the things that they miss, and there's a bunch of stuff that they miss, but one of the things that they miss is that better economic growth brings in more revenue. Because when people make more money, when corporations make more money, when everyone in the economy is making more money because there's all the incentives for growth, then there's more tax revenue too. And this bill, the Council of Economic Advisors estimates this bill is going to produce GDP growth that's 4.2 to 5.2 percentage points higher than if the bill doesn't pass, right? So it's imperative that we do this. With respect to your question, the specific provisions that are going to create growth, things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, tax relief for seniors, these are targeting segments of the population that are very responsive to incentives, that are very responsive to increase their labor supply, which produces more growth. Full expensing for R&D, full expensing for equipment, full expensing for manufacturing, for building factories. These are things that, again, are very incentive and will create an investment boom in the United States.
Now, those last two things, to me, are legit, because that's real money that these businesses can take and turn into more of their growth in the business. But the tax on tips and getting rid of that, you look at that, and that is not a given, is it not? I mean, the pro-growth spending that we've seen in the past, let's just say when the Democrats did it, Republicans called it fuzzy math. How is this one different from that?
Yeah, so what this one is different is that it targets the segments of the population that are demonstrated to be highly elastic, right? And so you think about something like no tax on overtime, right? Folks who are working overtime are the ones who already are very responsive to incentives. That's why they're working overtime. If they weren't responsive to incentives, they wouldn't be working overtime at all. And so what this bill does is it gives them even more incentives to work, even more incentives to increase their work, and that pushes the economy out. And by the way, this ties into the fact that we need to reindustrialize this country. We need to invest in manufacturing for national security purposes. And by doing things like no tax on overtime, right, that really helps play into that, because we get more workers working more, and that helps build industry.
I mean, tax cuts, of course, can be stimulative. But the question a lot of people have, and I'm not just talking about rivals and Democrats, is what mechanisms are actually in the plan, in there, to reduce the deficit throughout the 10 years, beyond the let's give these people a tax cut, let's hope they take the money, spend it, and it goes through the whole system?
Sure. So this is exactly what I want to talk about. So as I was saying before, when people look at the CBO score is very, very myopic. It's got blinders on it. It misses the big picture. Let me go through the things that it's missing with you. Okay. First of all, economic growth does better as a result of the bill. In all the incentives we just talked about, no full expensing on equipment, on factories, on R&D, no tax on tips, overtime, tax benefits for seniors, right? If between deregulation and tax incentives, we get economic growth to 3%, that produces an additional $4 trillion of revenues over the 10-year window, okay? Not included in the CBO score. What's next? Tariff revenue. Tariff revenue, as currently constituted, is going to bring in an additional roughly $3 trillion ballpark in the next in the 10-year budget.
Over 10 years.
But there's but there's more, right? The largest component of government discretionary expenditures last year were interest expenses, thanks to Biden inflation, thanks to the fiscal recklessness of the Biden administration. Interest expenditures, servicing the debt, cost more than defense last fiscal year, which is crazy, right? By pushing out the supply side of the economy, by creating tax incentives to produce more, to work more, to invest more, and by cutting red tape, we can get inflation pressures durably and sustainably down. That'll bring interest rates down, which will also cut hundreds of billions of dollars off the interest expense every year.
I would say Republicans in the Senate know that, and yet you got a couple here, more than a couple, who say, tell me something different because we don't like this. I'm specifically talking about Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, Republican, and Rand Paul of Kentucky. And here's what they said over the weekend on the Sunday morning shows.
I think the cuts currently in the bill are wimpy and anemic, but I still would support the bill, even with wimpy and anemic cuts, if they weren't going to explode the debt. The problem is the math doesn't add up.
I think we have enough to stop the process until the president gets serious about spending reduction and reducing the deficit. I would shout, this is a fight for freedom. We are mortgaging our children's future. It's wrong. It's immoral. It has to stop.
I mean, these guys are saying you've got a credibility problem. There's too much spending here. And if you look at even just $3.8 trillion, we've got a $36 trillion debt load at the moment. So what would you say to Rand Paul and Ron Johnson?
What I would say to them is to stop looking at the CBO score as the be-all and end-all. Look, the CBO has a very important role in the legislative process. It is a very important role that Congress has given it. But it's not the ultimate authority on these things. And if we look at what CBO said about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they said there'd be a $1 trillion plus hole in revenues. But that hasn't materialized. If you look at real revenues adjusted for inflation that were collected last year, they were a hair above where CBO said they would be before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was ever introduced. Right? Revenue as a share of GDP last year, 17.1%. Revenue as a share of GDP before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed, 17.1%. There was no durable long-term hole in revenues as a result of this, and that's because it's pro-growth policy. And so what these senators should do, in my opinion, is to look at the big picture, and that includes additional revenue from economic growth, additional revenue from tariffs, which are not included in the score.
Okay, but you know who's paying the tariffs. Companies like Mattel and Walmart who have said, we have to hike our prices at some point to cover that. And you know who shops at Walmart? Poor people. Okay, so I'm just saying this would have been easy. I mean, this morning, Stuart Varney said on his show, why not just do what the president actually floated, which was increase the tax rate for people making more than $2 million or something like that. Nobody wants a tax hike, and no Republican wants to have their name attached to that. But that is a way to have done it to make them shoulder some of it.
Yeah, well, look, I don't think that in the long run Americans are going to bear the burden of these tariffs at all. I think that's completely false. Because we didn't experience any macroeconomic inflation as a result of the 2018-2019 tariffs. There was zero sign of a drag on economic growth, zero sign of macroeconomic inflation. And if you look at the inflation to date, we've been raising tariffs since the first day of this administration, and there's no sign of inflation thus far.
I mean, 2017 was metals, aluminum, it was steel, it was narrower.
China, 2018, 2019, China.
Narrower still. This is 10% across the board.
And let me tell you why.
Okay.
The reason why is because American importers have flexibility over where they buy from. They're currently buying from China. They don't have to buy from China. They could buy from any number of other countries that we strike trade deals with that treat us better.
But Donald Trump just said Friday, I don't want Apple even making anything in other countries. I don't want them making US-bound phones in India. So suddenly India is radioactive, and Vietnam, you can't, well, you moved it to Vietnam, that's not good enough. You got to move it to the US. I mean, do you see what the critics of this are saying?
Look, the president is clear. He wants as much made in the USA as we can possibly do. Can we make everything in the world in the USA? No, we're not going to make everything in the entire universe in the USA. That's not going to happen, right? But we can make more here than we do. But the fact that we have this flexibility gives us the ability to force others to ultimately eat the burden of the tariffs. And that's what happened in 2018, 2019. And that's what's going to happen again now. In the short run, can there be volatility in some prices in the same way that there was volatility in the financial markets? Sure, it's possible. But in the fullness of time, the flexibility over adjusting our supply chains gives us the ability to force the other countries to eat the burden of the tariffs.
Which part of the bill do you see having some wiggle room for the Senate to maybe rewrite or cut out?
So let me be pretty careful that I'm not going to get ahead of negotiations with the Senate, because
Okay.
I think that the Senate is doing its job. I think that the Senate is going to continue doing its job and ultimately pass the bill. But at the end of the day, there will be a negotiation between the Senate, the House, and the President. And I really don't want to get ahead of that and interfere with it.
Well, senators say this thing is going to take some time, and the dream date of July 4th, where it gets on the president's desk, is highly unlikely. Do you see it that way?
Look, I think it's incredibly urgent that we pass this bill, because if we don't, it'll be the biggest tax hike in American history. You're talking about a $4 trillion tax hike on American workers and American firms. It'll very likely plunge the economy into recession. There'll be significant job losses. 9 million people will lose health insurance as a result of that. It's so critical that we pass this bill and prevent that from happening.
Stephen Miran, Council of Economic Advisors Chair, please come back. This thing's got a long tail, so we'll follow it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.